Welcome to this retrospective slash review for XCOM Enforcer. And I probably should have had this video up quite a few days before now, so I'll go ahead and apologize for my tardiness as far as that's concerned. But without further ado, let's just go ahead and jump into my thoughts on the game. And I guess the first main thought that I really want to get across is if you go and look at some of the average ratings for this game, or even just the game fact for it on GameFAQs, it doesn't paint a very positive picture of the game. And personally, I feel that they may be a little bit too harsh on the game, in my personal opinion. Let me go ahead and start with some of the technical aspects of the game. So I bought it on GOG, but it's also available on Steam as well, and probably other platforms from a PC perspective. And from that perspective, you can run it with either the N-Glide wrapper or Direct 3D. Now, N-Glide is probably a little bit better if you want to see the cutscenes in the game being more full screen, basically. But I feel like the Direct 3D renderer just felt smoother. The N-Glide renderer had a lot of little jitters and things of that nature that were very noticeable, at least on my computer. And I've got a pretty decent computer, but I am running an AMD video card, so maybe if you're running this with NVIDIA hardware, it would probably work better, possibly with the N-Glide wrapper. I don't know that for certain, however, but for me, with a Radeon card, the Direct 3D renderer worked much better in the game. It's much more smooth, and visually, there wasn't any downgrade. If anything, they were exactly the same or maybe even better under Direct 3D. The other thing for this game is it feels like it was custom made for a controller. Now, in the game's configuration, you can't really use a controller. However, I use a program by the name of Anti-Micro X to map my keyboard commands to my controller, and when I did that, the control was absolutely flawless for this game. Once I turned off mouse look, when I figured out that was a really bad idea for using this type of game, it was much better to control from that perspective. So let me roll back a little bit on some of the negativity surrounding this game. So I feel like a lot of the bad press this game gets is from people that were very familiar with the XCOM series, and for them, this is a complete and total departure from what XCOM is all about in their mindset. At least that's my understanding. For me, I came from it from the perspective of knowing that it was running the Unreal Engine, first Unreal Engine, and so I was thinking it was going to be a first-person shooter. So I was a little bit mistaken as well, because it's more of a third-person shooter, as you see here. But I was a little more accurate in my expectations for the game. So that probably has some sort of bearing on my thoughts of the game and why I'm not as disappointed with it as, say, someone who is a big fan of the XCOM series would be. But if you don't come into this thinking it's going to be like every other XCOM game and take it for its own merits, I think you'll come away with a better appreciation for the game. At least in my personal opinion. I could be wrong. But I will say, it was based off of Unreal Engine 1. And like a lot of games of that time, not just Unreal Engine based games, but most of the 3D games of that time, the character models are a little bit on the blocky side. So it's to be expected for a game from the early 2000s, basically. And I believe this game came out in 2001, if I'm not mistaken. And but other than that, I think graphically it's a very decent looking game. It still holds up, and I was able to run it in 1080p resolution without any issues whatsoever. So yeah, it's still functional, and it scales well to modern hardware. So definitely not a bad game graphically. From a sound perspective, I'd say that the music, the soundtrack, as it were, is a little bit on the, I wouldn't say bland side, but it's also not very exciting either. It's kind of there. It's not a negative or a positive, but it's not one of those soundtracks that's so bad that it becomes a detraction to the game. So I think it just kind of evens out as far as the soundtrack is concerned. The actual sound effects for the guns are actually quite good, and I enjoyed all that. Um, but I will say, and I don't know if this is intentional because, once again, I'm not familiar with the XCOM series, but the voice acting was extremely cheesy. And with this time period of how games were made and whatnot, you don't know if that was intentional or not, to be honest with you. So this, once again, comes down to my lack of understanding of the XCOM series. Maybe it's known for cheesy dialogue, and this is all perfectly on brand. I just don't personally know if that's the case or not. So yes, definitely cheesy voice acting for sure, especially with the scientist, which is basically the only person that really does have voice acting, with the exception of the final boss. Uh, so yeah, as long as you aren't expecting really great voice acting in the game, I think you'll be perfectly fine. In fact, if anything, the voice acting being as cheesy as it is may be part of its charm, to be honest with you. Um, it just is what it is. Early 2000s cheese, for sure. And I mean, you're talking about a game based off of an alien invasion and you being a robot. I don't know if there's actually any sentience or not, but basically a robot blowing up aliens. What sort of high voice acting were you expecting, or storyline for that matter? And then from that perspective, I guess this game definitely does. There's not much of a story. It's aliens have invaded, and you're squashing the aliens, and so not a huge story there. And that may be another thing that people probably criticized it for. But the game is a very good pick up and play mission style game, because the missions for the most part are actually very quick to get through, and you can probably, for most of them, get through 2 or 3 missions in a very short period of time, like 30 minutes or so. So it's not a very long game, and it's very easy, like I said, pick up and play. But also from that same perspective, it's a fairly easy game. Now, granted, I played on normal mode and not on hard, but even when I started going back and when I was recording this footage, I recorded it on hard mode, and the only thing that hard mode really seems to do, for the most part, from what I can understand, or what it felt like to me, I should say, is that it just made the upgrades much more expensive than in normal mode. Well, not much more expensive, but more expensive, all things considered. So that's probably where some of the difficulty would come from with playing on hard mode. But other than that, the game does have a lot of customization on how you want to play your enforcer. Especially when I was playing on hard mode, I knew which weapons I wanted to unlock and which ones not to unlock. So that's actually, from that perspective, it's probably a good idea to play on normal first, and then if you do want to play again on hard, you'll have a much better idea of where to spend your points. But having said that, I think maybe early on there's a little bit of difficulty, or not difficulty, but challenge when you don't have a lot of upgrades. But once you start getting the upgrades, the game really becomes almost trivial for the most part. The aliens really don't have much of a snowball's chance in hell of actually bringing you down for the most part. Even when I just started, spacing out, not even paying attention to my health, I'd be like, oh, look, my health's low. Okay, well, I can fix that here real quick. And it wasn't that big of a deal. So, not a very challenging game. There was a couple of defense missions that were a little frustrating, because it wasn't so much that you weren't you were being killed a lot, is that the object that you were trying to protect was getting killed very quickly, and it was hard to defend it. So there's a couple of defense missions like that where it was a little frustrating, but not too bad all things considered. And the final boss was a little bit challenging. Some of the other bosses, depending on when you played them in the game, they had a little bit of a challenge. But overall, not a spectacularly challenging game. I would say that basically throughout most of the missions, a lot of the terrain was actually fairly varied. There's a lot of different things you see. Like right now, I'm in a Red Rock style canyon, and then it goes from there to places like Vegas, to a flight line, to a mall, to all different sorts of environments. And just about every map, the environments had some sort of change to them, which is actually really neat. And they did a pretty decent job there up until about the Arctic base area. The Arctic base, it's like, oh, okay, here's the same visual style for all 5 of these missions. So they kind of ran out of ideas when they got there. But for the most part, they had a pretty decent mix of environments for you to play through, which is pretty decent. Other than that, I think the game, like I said, on a lot of places like howlongtobeat.com, the average rating for the game is about a 55, 56, somewhere in that range. And I think that's just overly too critical of the game. It's a silly little romp, very quick, very easy, kind of mindless, for lack of a better word. And but it's fun. It's a fun little game. And you know, it's funny because when I went to look at the average rating, it's actually on sale right now on Steam for like $1.50. So it goes on sale quite often, and you can get it for very cheap. And so for that price, it's actually worth playing if you're into some of these older, early 2000s, late 90s style video games. Definitely worth playing, and I'd probably give it a rating of about 80%. I was thinking of maybe docking it down to 75, but I feel like that's probably a little bit too mean of a score. It's not that bad. It's just fairly average, fairly easy, but at the same time, it's actually pretty fun too. So anyway, those are my thoughts on XCOM Enforcer. If you go into it, you know, with an open mind and not expecting the strategy type element of the other XCOM games in this series, I think you'll have a good time. So anyway, thank you very much for watching this video, and I'll see y'all in the next one. Take care.